Let's now talk about risk management. And you might say, I'm a hacker. What do I care about risk management? Well, you need to know why controls are put in place to begin with. First, let's define risk. Risk is the probability that a threat might actually materialize and actually cause damage. That's risk. Probability. There are risks for all kinds of things on your network. I mean, you can just see this whole list, and this isn't even a complete list. From virtualization, cloud computing, possible organized cybercrime, software that's not patched, malware, social networking, insider threats, botnets. I mean, this whole thing. Each one of these can bring risk to your information system. First thing is to identify what are your assets, your IT assets. Some of them will be digital. They'll be software. They'll be executables. Or they might be software that's not necessarily executable but is used, like configuration information or fonts or dictionaries. Some will be virtual and some will be physical. Any digital information content assets, this is part of IT. You'll have all sorts of hardware, physical media, physical IT equipment, or the licenses for software or hardware, usually software. You'll also have IT asset management systems, ITAM, IT asset management. So you'll have systems and tools to manage your assets. You'll have information about your assets, what we call the metadata. If you ever go searching on archive.org, you search for metadata, like give me anything to do with Windows XP. So metadata, information about information. You can also have asset contracts. How do you manage and replace and repair physical or other types of assets? You can also have services. Maybe you'll have combinations of assets or non-assets, non-IT assets, together they provide something like software as a service or training or maintenance. And you can have just straight non-IT assets that are still related to IT, like personnel and your organization and the need for the use and management of IT assets. So an organization will identify what they even have in terms of IT assets. With those assets, you got to figure out what are your threats. Now, a threat is not the same as a risk. A threat is anything that potentially could cause harm. Risk is the probability that the threat will do something. So threats don't have to necessarily cause harm every single time. We have a threat, but it wasn't actually taken advantage of. There's a threat that an airplane might fly into a building. Not a very high threat, but it's a threat. So a threat could be any circumstance, any event, any person, any organization that potentially could harm your system. And they could potentially have unauthorized access, destruction, disclosure, modification, denial of service. You can see all sorts of threats here. Some threats are from human actions and natural events, natural disaster type threats, environmental threats. Threats can be against people, processes, or technology. You can see all these. This is not a complete list of threats, but it is some common ones. When you're trying to figure out the relationship of threats to your assets, and this is what an organization will do. First of all, they'll identify all assets that are important. And then they'll do something called threat modeling. And what that is we'll take a look at the asset. And there'll be a bunch of us, not just one person does this. A bunch of us, what are all the possible things that could happen to this asset? Let's identify all the possible things. Everything from it gets destroyed in a fire, to we run out of licensing, to somebody hacks it, to somebody misuses it, somebody accidentally deletes it, whatever it is. And here's where you think outside the box and you get really creative. What could possibly happen in all directions to this one asset? So we identify the possible threats to one asset. And we prioritize, well, which ones need our attention? And there are ways to prioritize. I'm going to show you in just a second. We see if the threat is a real threat. We validate, and we do what we can to mitigate the threat. I'm going to talk about that a bunch soon. So threat modeling is a process. It's a structured process. We identify all potential threats to our people, our processes, our technology, our infrastructure, our assets. We visualize how each threat could possibly occur, and we quantify and rank the impact of each threat so we know which ones take priority. We use this information. We say, okay, this is much higher priority than that. We assign resources to reduce, mitigate, counter the threats. Here are some categories to network threats: sniffing and eavesdropping, DNS and ARP poisoning, man-in-the-middle attacks, denial of service, password-based attacks, firewall and intrusion detection attacks, session hijacking. For hosts, it could be misconfiguration, default configurations that are not safe or secure, missing patches, missing updates, password cracking, malware attacks, scanning, fingerprinting, arbitrary code execution, backdoor access, privilege escalation. For applications, they have their own threat categories. Injection, we'll be playing with that soon too. Improper data or input validation. Improper error handling. Hidden field manipulation, especially with browsers. Broken session management. Cryptography problems. SQL injection. Buffer overflows. Information disclosure. Security misconfiguration. Then we have something called the shrink wrap code attack. This is where I buy something off the shelf, I take it out of its package, and it already has bugs. It already has vulnerabilities that could be attacked. So a shrink wrap code attack takes advantage of a bug, a software bug that's present in the original version of the product. The vendor has put out a patch, but the sysadmin has not yet applied the patch. There are plenty of examples. Maybe the system came with default usernames and passwords and we didn't change them. Or here's one, Windows 10 has one called the Resilient File System, REFS, remote code vulnerability, one of many Windows 10 vulnerabilities. Or Windows 2016, Server 2016, Eternal Blue, SMBv1 arbitrary code execution. Or CentOS, CentOS Linux, web panel, file inclusion, file write arbitrary code execution. Just a few examples of the many, many, many that exist. Why do these bugs exist? Why are they sent to market? Well, the dirty secret is that organizations are in a hurry to get a product to market so that they can sell it as fast as possible. And quite frankly, in almost all organizations, security is an afterthought. And they figure, oh, just ship it and then we'll send out a patch afterwards. And that's just the reality. Now, how about risk management? We know what risk is. We know what threats are. We know what vulnerabilities are. Risk management. This is a process. You identify, evaluate, and prioritize the risks. You will apply whatever resources you need to minimize or control or monitor the risk, reduce the probability or the impact that the risk will actually be attacked. One thing that organizations really have to do, and the big ones do it, the smaller ones, they may not understand the need, is the business impact analysis, the BIA. This is your first step in risk assessment. If this thing happened, what would happen to our business? Would we be knocked offline for 3 days and lose $1 million in sales? So the BIA, the BIA, is the process of determining the criticality of business activities and associated requirements. So like Susie Q's laptop is not that important in the overall business criticality unless Susie Q is the CEO and she has secrets to her laptop that we don't dare lose. So the BIA, we use it to ensure operational resilience and continuity of operations during and after business disruption. This is like one of the first things you do with risk assessment, and also you have to have this when you're figuring out disaster recovery. What systems do we need to bring back first? So the BIA will quantify the impact of a service, if its delivery is disrupted, the risks to that service, the recovery time objective, and the recovery point objective. What that means, the RTO is at what point, how soon do we need to get this particular system or service back up and running? So like an RTO could be 24 hours or 6 hours or 5 minutes, whatever. And obviously the shorter, the more expensive, right? The recovery point objective is how much of it. Like, do we need to have everything restored or just have like a skeleton functionality? Like if our email server goes down, we need to get people's email working again, but we can work on restoring their old emails later. So the RTO might be, 12 hours, but the recovery point objective is functioning service, even if we have not restored everybody's mailboxes, all their old emails. So these are things that have to be figured out and worked out. RTOs and RPOs are used to develop strategies, and they're used to develop business disaster recovery plans, BCP and DR plans. DR is actually the IT part of the overall business continuity plan. With risk assessment, you're identifying security risks and you're assessing the threat that they pose. The ultimate purpose is to reduce or mitigate the risk. You're trying to prevent security incidents or compliance failures. So you're going to start with risk intelligence and threat analysis. So you'll make 3 lists. One is a list of your assets and how much damage it would cost you if you lose or expose that asset. What business processes depend on those assets and the threats that could impact those assets and how likely those threats are. Those are the 3 things you need to list. You'll use that information from the risk assessment process, and you can do that to determine which threats are the most important to mitigate. Now, there are 2 ways of doing this, qualitative and quantitative. And yes, this will come up in the exam. And yes, you need to understand this because you need to understand why your client puts emphasis on things. The qualitative is subjective. It assigns probability and impact. And it can either be on a scale of 1 to 10 or it can be like high, medium, low. So you would have the likelihood of something happening versus the consequence, okay? So like if it's very rare and the consequence would be insignificant, then the risk is low. But if it's possible and however the consequence is insignificant, could be medium. If the consequence is high, it could be, or moderate, it could be high. If it's severe, it would be extreme. So you can see the more likely and the bigger the impact, the more extreme it becomes. So that is qualitative risk assessment. Quantitative is where you put a dollar figure or a financial value to something. It's objective. Qualitative is more subjective. We feel it would be like this. Quantitative, you put a financial value to something. You assign a monetary risk or a monetary value to that risk. And there's a formula, and you need to know this formula, so pay attention. The single loss expectancy, SLE, times the annual rate of occurrence equals the annual loss expectancy. In other words, you do this by year. This is going to happen 10 times a year, and we know this from historical data. It's going to happen 10 times a year, and it's going to cost $1,000 every time it happens. That is 10 times 1,000. That's $1,000 annual risk. So SLE, single loss, times ARO, annual rate of occurrence, equals annual loss expectancy. And then there's one other thing here. The single loss expectancy is what is the value of the asset times the exposure factor. Like Did we lose that thing percent, or is like half of it still usable? So like if somebody attacks the website, and every time the website gets attacked, we lose $100,000. Or maybe this is a $200,000 a day website. I mean, we gain that in sales. But every time people attack it, we only lose half the functionality. So we only lose $100,000. So that's the exposure factor. What is the value of the asset when it happens once, when the attack happens once, and how much of the asset do we lose? It could be 100%, could be 10%, 50%. So you have to just kind of figure that out. So the asset value, how much revenue does the asset bring in, or what's the cost to replace it? And then the exposure factor, the percentage of the AV that is lost on a single incident. The annual rate of occurrence is how many times over a year. Now, if it happens like over a couple years, then you amortize it. So like if this thing happens every other year, the annual rate of occurrence is half, not one. If it happened every year, then the ARO would be one time every year, once a year. If it happens every 2 years, it'd be half, because it would be 1 divided by 2, it'd be half. Then the annual loss expectancy is annually, how much would this risk cost us? And you have to use data that you already know, either historical data from your own experience or from other similar businesses in an environment like yours. This allows you to concretely justify cost. We can say, hey, we know that if we don't update the antivirus and spend X amount on antivirus for all of our workstations, that we're going to lose X amount of productivity days, which equates to X amount of money. So let's take a look at an example. A hard drive fails every 3 years. I hope not, but anyway, here's our example, okay? A hard drive fails every 3 years. The cost to buy a new hard drive is $300. It will take 10 hours to restore the operating system and the software to a new hard disk. It will also take another 4 hours on top of those 10 hours to restore the database from the last backup to that new hard disk. In other words, 14 hours total. The recovery person earns $10 an hour. They better earn a lot more these days, but this is our example, just to make it easy. Okay, so this person earns $10 an hour, and it's going to take them 14 hours. That is $140 in labor cost right off the bat. You need to calculate the single loss expectancy, the annual rate of occurrence, and the annual loss expectancy. Okay, let's do that. Let's assume that the exposure factor is 100%. You lose the drive, there ain't nothing to recover. Okay. What's the closest approximate cost of the replacement and recovery operation per year? Now, of course, this hard drive fails every 3 years, so let's figure out a single loss expectancy, and then we got to split it across 3 years, divide it by 3. About $146. How did we get there? Let's take a look. Hard drive fails every 3 years. Annual rate of occurrence is about 1/3. I'm being a little generous here, 0.34. In reality, it'd be more like 0.33333333, threes forever. The cost to buy a new hard drive in this case is $300. It's going to take 10 hours to restore the OS plus 4 more hours to restore the database with a 100% loss, so 100% exposure factor. The person doing it earns $10 an hour, all right? Which means 14 hours times $10 an hour, that's $140 plus 300 just for the hardware. That's $440 single loss expectancy. And we're not even calculating, does this thing impact our revenue on a daily basis? Okay, $300 to replace the hard drive. The labor is 10 plus 4 hours times $10 an hour, $140. Single loss expectancy is $440. Following so far? Annual rate of occurrence once every 3 years. In other words, 1/3 per year. So the annual loss expectancy is $440 over 3. That's about $146, $147. whip out your calculator. 440 divided by 3. So the closest approximate cost to the replacement recovery operation would be slightly more than $146. That's quantitative risk assessment. Yes, you will need to know how to do this. Finally, there's something called the line, also known as residual risk. You get to a point where it's not worth spending any more money or any more effort. You draw an imaginary line. Everything above the line is worth the time, effort, cost. Anything that is too expensive, too difficult, it's so unlikely it'll happen, it's not worth our trouble, that falls below the line. That's what we call the residual risk. It's because putting in the controls are too expensive. It's not worth protecting, not worth enough. It's so unlikely to happen. Or it's something we never foresaw. Or the impact would be very minor. What you do in the case of below the line stuff, residual risk, you just have a disaster recovery plan. And the disaster recovery plan, the DR plan, just catches everything that falls below the line. So that's residual risk. Now, you're pointing out all these risks to the client, or you're on the team that figures out does the risk assessment. What are the responses? Well, you could flat out avoid the risk. Now, I have said already that the way to have a completely secure network is to not have a network at all. You want full security, don't have the thing. Avoid means, okay, whatever it is that we're doing that is risky, just stop. Get rid of the asset or stop doing the thing that is causing the risk. That's avoidance. Don't be there in the first place. Mitigate means, okay, we know that we have to have this thing. There's a chance something is going to happen. Let's reduce the impact. Let's put something in place to reduce the impact in case something does happen. Transfer is, let's make someone else responsible. Usually that's in the form of buying insurance. Except, hey, the risk could happen, but we're not going to do anything about it. Yes, we have seen historically that airplanes do fly into buildings, sometimes accidentally, sometimes very much on purpose. That's very rare, and we are not about to pick up and move our entire company to another HQ because of that risk. So we accept the risk. We're not going to do anything about it. And then there's the really bad strategy, rejecting the risk. This is where management says, that's not even going to happen. Not. Any management that says that, they got to pull their head out. So let's take a look at this example here. An internet marketing company decides they don't want to follow the rules for the General Data Protection, the EU rules, because it would create too much work for them. They wanted to buy insurance, but no insurance company would write a policy to cover any fines they might receive. They considered how much the fines might be and decided to ignore the regulation and its requirements because the fines, if it does happen, it's cheaper to pay the fine than to put the controls in place to hopefully eliminate or greatly reduce the risk. In this case, they chose to accept the risk. They chose to accept the risk because it just wasn't, they did a cost-benefit analysis and they said, you know what, we might get busted here and there and it's just cheaper to pay the fine and keep going. In this case, they did try to transfer the risk, but they couldn't. They didn't reject the risk. They realize it could happen. They're just not going to do anything about it. If they get caught, they're okay with paying the fine. So this is our look at risk. Identifying it, managing it, having strategies, quantifying it, determining, what's above the line, what's below the line, how are we going to deal with it? Risk. And now, on to our next topic.